24 hours. That's all that remains before the most significant moment in human history. Peter doesn't know that his bold promises will crumble before sunrise. John has no idea he'll be the only disciple brave enough to stand at the cross. And Judas has already made his choice, but even he doesn't understand the weight of what he's about to do. In the next 70 minutes, you're going to experience every moment of those final 24 hours. You'll see what they saw, feel what they felt, and understand how the greatest act of love in history unfolded through the eyes of those who were there. Before we begin this journey through Scripture, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And at the end of this narrative, rate from 0 to 10 how deeply this story touched your heart. Let's begin. 24 hours remain. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jerusalem's narrow streets as Simon Peter walked with purpose toward the city. His calloused fisherman's hands swung at his sides, and his mind raced with anticipation. Passover, the feast of liberation, the celebration of freedom from Egypt's bondage. But this year felt different. This year they would celebrate with the Messiah himself. Peter's chest swelled with pride as he thought about it. For 3 years, he'd walked beside the Master. He'd seen the miracles. He'd heard the teachings. He'd even walked on water. Well, briefly, before his faith faltered. But that was the old Peter. The new Peter was ready for anything. "We should get 2 lambs," Peter said to Andrew, who walked beside him through the marketplace. "One might not be enough with all of us." Around them, Jerusalem buzzed with pre-Passover energy. Merchants shouted their prices. The smell of roasting lamb already filled the air as families prepared their feast. Pilgrims from across the Roman world crowded every street, their various accents creating a symphony of anticipation. Peter barely noticed. His thoughts were on tomorrow. Tomorrow, surely, Jesus would reveal his plan. Tomorrow, perhaps, the kingdom would finally come. The Romans would be overthrown. Israel would be free again. Peter's hand instinctively moved to the short sword hidden beneath his cloak. He'd brought it, just in case. "Do you think this is the year?" Andrew asked quietly, reading his brother's thoughts. "The year he establishes the kingdom?" Peter's jaw set with determination. "It has to be. The people are ready. They're waiting for a sign. And whatever happens, brother, I'm ready to die for him if necessary." He meant every word. What Peter didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that in less than 12 hours he wouldn't die for Jesus. He would deny even knowing him. 3 times. Before the rooster crowed, but now in this moment, Peter was invincible, or so he thought. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon. 23 hours and 30 minutes remain. While Peter bargained for supplies in the lower market, John stood in the doorway of a large upper room, his young face contemplative as he surveyed the space. This room would host more than just a meal tonight. John had learned to watch Jesus carefully. Others listened to his words. John watched his eyes, and lately those eyes carried a weight that troubled the young disciple deeply. Something was coming. Something Jesus had been trying to tell them, but that none of them wanted to hear. "Is this acceptable, Rabbi?" John called down the stairs to where Jesus stood in the courtyard below, speaking with the owner of the house. Jesus looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that brief exchange, John felt it again. That unexplainable sadness mixed with fierce love. It was the same look Jesus had given him that morning when John had asked about the future. Jesus had simply said, "Before the rooster crows tomorrow, everything will change." What did that mean? John turned back to the room. It was spacious, freshly swept, with cushions arranged around a low table, perfect for the Passover meal. He could imagine them all here tonight, the 13 of them, celebrating as they had done in previous years. But this year felt different. John's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the cushions. He'd been closer to Jesus than most of the others. He'd been there on the mountain when Jesus' face shone like the sun. He'd heard Jesus pray in private. He'd witnessed moments the others hadn't seen. And in those moments, he'd begun to understand something that terrified him. This Passover wasn't just about remembering Israel's liberation from Egypt. This Passover was about something far greater, something that would require a sacrifice none of them were ready to comprehend. "Lord," John had asked that morning, "when you establish your kingdom, may I sit beside you?" Jesus had smiled sadly. "You don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I'm about to drink?" "Of course," John had answered confidently. Jesus had simply touched his shoulder. "You will drink from my cup, but not in the way you imagine." Now, preparing this room, John couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be the last normal evening they'd ever share. He was right. But even John, perceptive as he was, couldn't foresee the horror of the next 24 hours. He couldn't imagine seeing his beloved master beaten beyond recognition. He couldn't imagine standing at the foot of a cross, watching the life drain from the man he loved more than his own father. He couldn't imagine that before this time tomorrow, Jesus would entrust his own mother to John's care, because everyone else would have fled. But that knowledge remained mercifully hidden. For now, John simply arranged the room and waited for evening to fall. 23 hours remain. In a shadowed corner of the temple treasury, Judas Iscariot's fingers closed around a leather pouch, 30 pieces of silver. The coins clinked together with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. Caiaphas, the high priest, watched with barely concealed satisfaction as Judas weighed the pouch in his hand. "You're certain of the location?" Caiaphas asked, his voice smooth as oil. Judas nodded slowly. His throat felt tight. "After the meal, he always goes to Gethsemane, the Garden of Olive presses on the Mount of Olives. It's quiet there. Private." "Perfect." Caiaphas leaned forward. "It must be tonight, Judas, before the Sabbath, before he can stir up the crowds any further. You understand the necessity?" Did he understand? Judas had been asking himself that question for days now, ever since the idea first crept into his mind like a serpent. Ever since he'd begun to realize that Jesus wasn't going to be the kind of Messiah Judas had hoped for. There would be no revolution, no overthrow of Rome, no positions of power and wealth for the disciples, just talk of suffering and death and sacrifice. What kind of Messiah chose suffering? "He's dangerous," Judas heard himself saying, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "His teachings, they could cause Rome to destroy us all. Better one man should die than the whole nation perish. Isn't that what you said?" Caiaphas nodded approvingly. "Exactly. You're doing Israel a service, Judas. History will remember this as an act of patriotism. But even as Judas pocketed the silver, something twisted inside him. He remembered 3 years ago, the day Jesus had called him. "Follow me," Jesus had said, and Judas had left everything. His business, his plans, his carefully constructed life. For what? To end up betraying the very man he'd followed? No. No, this wasn't betrayal. This was pragmatism. Jesus was leading them all to disaster. Someone had to stop it. Someone had to face reality. And if Judas happened to profit in the process, well, wasn't that just wisdom? The pouch felt heavy against his chest as he left the temple, heavier than 30 pieces of silver should feel. Above him, the sky was beginning to darken. Soon, they would gather for the Passover meal. Jesus would break bread and pour wine. They would sing the traditional psalms. It would all seem so normal. And later tonight, in the darkness of Gethsemane, Judas would lead the guards to Jesus. A kiss. That's all it would take. A simple kiss to identify him. Judas touched his lips with trembling fingers. What he didn't know, what he couldn't foresee, was that in less than 24 hours, he would be hanging from a tree, the silver scattered at his feet, his intestines spilled out in a field bought with blood money. He didn't know that his name would become synonymous with betrayal for all of human history. He didn't know that the guilt would be so crushing that death would seem like mercy. But for now, he simply walked through Jerusalem's streets, the silver heavy in his pocket, and prepared to join his brothers for supper. Satan had already entered his heart. But Judas told himself he was just being reasonable. 22 hours and 30 minutes remain. In a modest home not far from the temple, Mary, the mother of Jesus, stood at a window overlooking the city. Her hands rested on the windowsill, weathered from decades of work, but still strong. She was perhaps 50 years old now, though grief had aged her beyond her years. The city sparkled in the late afternoon light, but Mary barely saw it. She was remembering. 33 years ago, an angel had appeared to her. "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High." She'd believed. Of course she'd believed. How could she not, after everything she'd witnessed? But she'd also remembered something else, something that had haunted her for over 3 decades. When Jesus was just 40 days old, they'd taken him to the temple. An old man named Simeon had held her baby in his arms and prophesied, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel." And then Simeon had looked directly at Mary, and his next words had chilled her soul. "And a sword will pierce your own soul too." A sword. Mary's hand moved unconsciously to her heart. For 33 years, she'd wondered when that sword would fall. She'd worried through his childhood. She'd feared when he began his ministry. She'd watched as the religious leaders grew to hate him, as their murder plots whispered through Jerusalem's streets. And now, standing at this window during Passover, Mary felt it. The sword was coming. Soon. "Mother?" Her niece entered the room. "Will you join us for the Passover?" Mary turned, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. How could she sit at a table and celebrate liberation when she felt such dread? "Is Jesus coming?" Mary asked quietly. "I don't know. They say he's preparing something in an upper room with his disciples." Mary nodded slowly. She'd seen him 2 days ago. He'd embraced her longer than usual, held her as if memorizing the feeling. "I love you, Mother," he'd said. Just that. Nothing more. But it was the way he said it, as if it were the last time. Mothers know. They always know. Mary returned her gaze to the window, to the city where her son taught and healed and loved with an intensity that frightened even those closest to him. Somewhere out there, in an upper room being prepared, her firstborn son would share a final meal with his friends. And though Mary didn't know the details, didn't know about the betrayal, the arrest, the trials, the torture, she knew in her bones that the sword Simeon spoke of was about to pierce her soul. She'd brought the Savior of the world into this world through her own body, and soon she would watch that same body be destroyed. But for now, she simply stood at the window and prayed. Prayed for strength, prayed for understanding, prayed that somehow God's will would be done, even if it broke her heart in the process. The sun touched the horizon. 22 hours remain. In the most ornate chamber of the high priest's house, Caiaphas stood before a bronze mirror, adjusting his elaborate robes. Everything had to be perfect tonight. Behind him, 3 members of the Sanhedrin waited: Annas, his father-in-law and former high priest, and 2 chief priests whose loyalty was absolute. "The arrangements are made?" Annas asked, his voice raspy with age but sharp with intelligence. "Yes." Caiaphas turned from the mirror. "Judas will signal us after their meal. We'll have the temple guards ready, Roman soldiers too, if necessary." "The charges?" "Blasphemy, primarily. Claiming to be the Son of God. That's enough for us to condemn him under Jewish law. But not enough for Rome to execute him," one of the chief priests interjected. "Pilate doesn't care about our religious disputes." Caiaphas smiled coldly. "Then we'll add insurrection. We'll say he claims to be king of the Jews, that he's inciting rebellion against Caesar. Pilate will have no choice but to act." It was brilliant, really. Use Rome's own paranoia against them. Annas nodded approvingly. "And it must happen quickly, before the Sabbath, before he can gather more followers." Caiaphas moved to the window, looking out over the temple complex. From here he could see the court of the Gentiles, where just days ago Jesus had overturned the money changers' tables. The memory still burned. Jesus had made them look like fools. Worse, he'd challenged their authority, their prophet, their entire system. "He's dangerous," Caiaphas said softly. "Not because of what he does, but because of what he represents. Hope, change, a new way. If we let him continue, Rome will come and take away our position and our nation." It was true. Or at least, Caiaphas had convinced himself it was true. Better one man should die than the whole nation be destroyed. What Caiaphas didn't know, what his brilliant political mind couldn't grasp, was that this one man was the very person who would save not just the nation, but the entire world. He didn't know that by killing Jesus, he would actually accomplish God's plan of salvation. He didn't know that the blood he was about to shed would become the blood of the new covenant. He thought he was protecting his power. He didn't realize he was fulfilling prophecy. "Everything is ready," Caiaphas announced to his co-conspirators. "By this time tomorrow, the Nazarene will be dead and order will be restored." The 4 men nodded in satisfaction. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. 21 hours remain. As darkness fell over Jerusalem, 6 different people moved through the city, each toward their own destiny, each unaware of how their paths would intersect in the most consequential event in human history. Peter walked with provisions for the feast, his confidence unshaken, his sword ready. John lit lamps in the upper room, his heart troubled by what he couldn't quite understand. Judas counted his silver one more time, trying to silence the voice in his head that screamed he was making a terrible mistake. Mary knelt in prayer, tears streaming down her face as a mother's intuition tore at her soul. Caiaphas sent word to the captain of the temple guard. "Be ready. Tonight we arrest the Nazarene." And Jesus stood alone on a rooftop, looking over the city he'd wept for just days before. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he'd cried then. "How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Now, as the Passover moon began to rise, Jesus descended from the rooftop and walked toward the upper room where his disciples were gathering. He knew everything that was about to unfold, every betrayal, every denial, every lash of the whip, every thorn in the crown, every nail through flesh. And still, he walked forward. Because this was why he'd come. This was the cup he would drink. This was the love that would save the world. The pieces were all moving into position. The players were taking the stage. The greatest drama in history was about to begin. Peter arrived at the upper room first, laughing with Andrew about something inconsequential. John lit the last lamp, casting warm light across the prepared table. Judas climbed the stairs slowly, the silver heavy in his pocket, and Jesus entered last, looking at each of his disciples with such love that several of them later said they should have known something was desperately wrong. But they didn't know. They couldn't imagine. "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer," Jesus said softly. "Before I suffer." No one asked what he meant. They would understand soon enough. 20 hours remain. The 13 men gather in the upper room. Lamplight flickers across their faces as they recline around the low table, following the ancient Passover tradition. None of them know this will be the last meal they share together. None of them know that before sunrise, one will be dead by his own hand, one will deny he ever knew Jesus, and the rest will scatter like sheep without a shepherd. But Jesus knows. He knows everything. And still, he begins to wash their feet. John watched in stunned silence as Jesus stood from the table, removed his outer garment, and wrapped a towel around his waist. This wasn't how Passover was supposed to begin. The master was acting like a servant. No, worse than a servant. He was acting like a slave. Only the lowest household slave washed feet, removing the dirt and filth from dusty roads. Jesus poured water into a basin and knelt before Peter. "Lord," Peter's voice cracked with shock, "are you going to wash my feet?" John leaned forward, his heart pounding. He'd seen Jesus do many unexpected things over the past 3 years, but this felt different, more intimate, more disturbing. "You don't understand what I'm doing now," Jesus said softly, his hands hovering over Peter's feet. "But you will understand later." But you will understand later." "No!" Peter pulled his feet back. "You will never wash my feet. I'm the one who should be washing yours." John understood Peter's reaction. They all felt it. This was wrong. Backward, the King of Kings kneeling before fishermen and tax collectors. But Jesus looked up at Peter with such intensity that the big fisherman froze. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." The words hung in the air like a sword. John felt his breath catch. There was something in Jesus' voice, something final, something that spoke of more than just clean feet. Peter's face went pale. "Then, Lord, not just my feet but my hands and my head as well." A sad smile crossed Jesus' face. "Those who have bathed need only to wash their feet. They are clean all over." He paused, and his eyes swept across all of them, lingering on Judas for just a moment longer than the others. "And you are clean," Jesus said quietly, "though not every one of you." John felt a chill run down his spine. What did that mean? Jesus moved around the circle, washing each disciple's feet with deliberate care. When he reached John, their eyes met, and John saw something in the Master's gaze that made him want to weep. It was love. Pure, desperate, infinite love. But it was also goodbye. "John," Jesus whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "What's about to happen? Stay close. Your brothers will need you, and my mother will need you most of all." "Shupawen and state. Your Moses stay. Your brothers will need you, and my mother will need you most of all." John watched in stunned silence as Jesus stood from the table, removed his outer garment, and wrapped a towel around his waist. This wasn't how Passover was supposed to begin. The Master was acting like a servant. No, worse than a servant. He was acting like a slave. Only the lowest household slave washed feet, removing the dirt and filth from dusty roads. Jesus poured water into a basin and knelt before Peter. "Lord," Peter's voice cracked with shock, "are you going to wash my feet?" John leaned forward, his heart pounding. He'd seen Jesus do many unexpected things over the past 3 years, but this felt different, more intimate, more disturbing. "You don't understand what I'm doing now," Jesus said softly, his hands hovering over Peter's feet. "But you will understand later." But you will understand later." "No!" Peter pulled his feet back. "You will never wash my feet. I'm the one who should be washing yours." John understood Peter's reaction. They all felt it. This was wrong. Backward, the King of Kings kneeling before fishermen and tax collectors. But Jesus looked up at Peter with such intensity that the big fisherman froze. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." The words hung in the air like a sword. John felt his breath catch. There was something in Jesus' voice, something final, something that spoke of more than just clean feet. Peter's face went pale. "Then, Lord, not just my feet but my hands and my head as well." A sad smile crossed Jesus' face. "Those who have bathed need only to wash their feet. They are clean all over." He paused, and his eyes swept across all of them, lingering on Judas for just a moment longer than the others. "And you are clean," Jesus said quietly, "though not every one of you." John felt a chill run down his spine. What did that mean? Jesus moved around the circle, washing each disciple's feet with deliberate care. When he reached John, their eyes met, and John saw something in the Master's gaze that made him want to weep. It was love. Pure, desperate, infinite love. But it was also goodbye. "John," Jesus whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "What's about to happen? Stay close. Your brothers will need you, and my mother will need you most of all." "Shupawen and state. Your Moses stay. Your brothers will need you, and my mother will need you most of all." Peter's world tilted. Betray. One of them would betray the Master? Impossible. "Lord, "Surely not I." The question came from multiple voices simultaneously. Each disciple looked at the others with suspicion and confusion. Peter felt his hand instinctively move toward the sword beneath his cloak. If one of them was a traitor, he would deal with it. Now. But who? Who could possibly betray Jesus? Not John. He was practically Jesus's shadow, always close, always devoted. Not James or Andrew. They'd given up everything to follow him. Not Thomas, despite his doubts. Not Matthew, who'd left his tax booth. Not any of them. Could he? Peter's heart raced as he looked around the table. Each man looked equally confused, equally troubled. Even Judas looked shocked, though Peter noticed he was the only one who didn't immediately ask, "Surely not I, Lord." Jesus' face was filled with such profound sadness that Peter felt his chest tighten. "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me," Jesus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays him. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Better if he had not been born. Peter had never heard Jesus speak so harshly about anyone. Whatever this betrayal was, it was worse than anything they could imagine. Peter caught John's eye and gave him a quick nod. John was reclining next to Jesus, close enough to ask quietly. Peter gestured urgently. "Ask him who it is." John leaned back against Jesus' chest. They were reclining Roman style, so this position allowed for private conversation, and whispered, "Lord, who is it?" Peter strained to hear the answer, but Jesus spoke too softly. He only saw Jesus dip a piece of bread in the dish and hand it to Judas. "What you are about to do, do quickly," Jesus said to Judas. Judas took the bread, and for just a moment, Peter saw something flicker across his face. Was it guilt, determination, fear? Then Judas stood abruptly and headed for the door. "Where's he going?" Peter asked, confused. Did Jesus send him to buy something, or to give money to the poor? No one seemed to know. The door closed behind Judas, and Peter heard his footsteps descending the stairs quickly, too quickly, like a man fleeing. "Now is the Son of Man glorified," Jesus said suddenly, and his voice was strange, filled with both sorrow and triumph. "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jewish leaders, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." Peter felt panic rising in his chest. Going? Where was he going? And why couldn't they follow? "Lord," Peter interrupted, his voice urgent. "Where are you going?" Jesus turned to him, and the look in his eyes made Peter's blood run cold. "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Later. What did that mean? "Lord," Peter insisted, standing now, his hand on his sword. "Why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." It was a vow, a solemn promise. Peter meant every word. He would die for Jesus, gladly, without hesitation. Jesus looked at him for a long moment, and Peter saw something in that gaze that he'd never seen before. Pity. "Will you really lay down your life for me?" Jesus asked softly. "Very truly I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. The words hit Peter like a physical blow. Disown? Him? Never. "Even if all fall away on account of you," Peter said fiercely, his voice rising. "I never will. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." The other disciples echoed his sentiment, each one proclaiming their loyalty, their willingness to die. Peter believed it with every fiber of his being. He had no idea that in just a few hours he would be standing in a courtyard, warming himself by a fire. And a servant girl would say, "You were with Jesus of Nazareth." Either a servant girl would say, "You were with Jesus of Nazareth." And Peter would spit and curse and swear, "I don't know the man," 3 times, just as Jesus said. But for now, in this moment, Peter was invincible, his loyalty unshakable, his courage absolute. Jesus simply looked at him with infinite sadness and infinite love. "Simon, Simon," Jesus said quietly, using Peter's old name, "Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." When you have turned back. Not if. When. Jesus knew. He already knew Peter would fail. And he loved him anyway. 19 hours remain. The night air hit Judas's face like a slap as he stumbled down the stairs from the upper room. His hands were shaking. The bread Jesus had given him, the honored portion, the sign of special favor, sat heavy in his stomach like a stone. "What you are about to do quickly." Jesus knew. Of course he knew. Jesus always knew. But if he knew, why didn't he stop it? Why didn't he call Judas out in front of everyone? Why did he wash Judas's feet with the same tenderness he'd shown the others? Why did he look at Judas with such devastating sadness instead of anger? Judas pressed his back against the wall of a building, trying to catch his breath. The streets of Jerusalem were quieter now, most families inside celebrating Passover, but Judas could still hear snatches of song, the traditional psalms being sung behind closed doors. "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." Judas wanted to scream. No, he'd made his choice. He was doing the right thing. Jesus was leading them all to destruction. Someone had to stop him. Someone had to face reality. The 30 pieces of silver pressed against his chest. Judas pushed off from the wall and began walking quickly toward the temple. The captain of the guard would be waiting. The soldiers would be ready. All Judas had to do was lead them to Gethsemane after midnight, after Jesus finished praying, after the other disciples fell asleep, as they always did. 1 kiss. That's all it would take. But as Judas walked through Jerusalem's shadowed streets, he couldn't shake the image of Jesus' face, the way he'd looked at Judas when handing him the bread. It wasn't condemnation. It was grief. Like watching a beloved friend choose a path toward destruction and being powerless to stop it. "I don't have a choice," Judas whispered to himself. "This is the only way." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He could turn back right now. He could run back to the upper room. He could confess everything. Jesus would forgive him. Judas knew this with certainty. Jesus forgave everyone. But that would mean admitting he was wrong, admitting he'd been selfish, greedy, blind. And Judas's pride wouldn't allow it. So he kept walking toward the temple, toward the waiting guards, toward the moment that would define him for all eternity. Behind him, in the upper room, Jesus was breaking bread and saying words that would echo through history. "This is my body, given for you." But Judas couldn't hear them anymore. He was already gone. After Judas left, an odd peace settled over the room, though John couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was in motion. Jesus took bread in his hands. Not just any bread, the unleavened bread of Passover, baked without yeast as their ancestors had done in their hurry to leave Egypt. But what Jesus did next wasn't part of the traditional Seder. He held the bread up and gave thanks. Then, slowly, deliberately, he broke it. The sound of tearing bread seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. "Take and eat," Jesus said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." John took a piece of the broken bread, but his hand trembled. "Given for you." Not represents my body. Not symbolizes my body. Yes, my body. Given for you. John looked at the bread in his hand, broken, torn, split apart. And suddenly, sickeningly, he understood. Jesus wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was speaking literally. His body would be broken, torn, split apart for them. John forced himself to eat the bread, but he could barely swallow. Around the table, the other disciples ate, but John saw confusion on their faces. What was Jesus doing? This wasn't part of the Passover ritual. Then Jesus took the cup of wine, the third cup, the cup of redemption in the traditional Seder. He held it up, and lamplight gleamed through the dark liquid. "This cup is the new covenant in my blood," Jesus said, and his voice cracked slightly, "which is poured out for you. Drink from it, all of you." Blood. Poured out. John's hands shook as he took the cup and drank. The wine was bitter on his tongue, or perhaps that was just his tears. A new covenant. The old covenant had been sealed with the blood of lambs, sacrificed at Passover, their blood painted on doorposts, so that death would pass over the houses of Israel. But this new covenant would be sealed with different blood. With Jesus' blood. He was the Lamb. John looked up and found Jesus watching him, and in that moment, everything Jesus had ever said suddenly made terrible, perfect sense. "I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." A ransom. Jesus was going to die. Not accidentally, not tragically, intentionally, as a sacrifice, as the final Passover lamb. John wanted to scream, to protest, to say there had to be another way, but the words stuck in his throat because somewhere, deep in his spirit, he knew this was exactly why Jesus had come. Not to overthrow Rome, not to establish an earthly kingdom, but to die. To die so that they could live. "I tell you," Jesus continued, his eyes sweeping across all of them, "I will not drink from this fruit of the vine again, until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." His Father's kingdom. Not the kingdom they'd been expecting. Not thrones and crowns and political power. Something far greater, far more costly, far more glorious. Jesus began to speak then, words tumbling out as if he needed to tell them everything before it was too late. "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going there to prepare a place for you. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." But John's heart was troubled, desperately troubled, because Jesus kept speaking about leaving, about going away, about them being sad but then rejoicing. And then Jesus said something that made John's blood freeze. "A time is coming when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone." "No," John wanted to shout. "We'll never leave you." But Peter had already said that, and Jesus had already predicted Peter's denial. Could it be true? Would they all abandon him? Jesus stood then and gestured toward the door. "Come now," he said quietly. "Let us leave." The disciples gathered their cloaks, confused, uncertain. Where were they going? The night was late. Shouldn't they sleep before tomorrow? Tomorrow. Would there even be a tomorrow? Jesus led them down the stairs and into the dark streets of Jerusalem. John stayed close, so close he could hear Jesus murmuring prayers under his breath. They walked through the city gate and down into the Kidron Valley. John knew where they were going. Gethsemane, the Garden of Olive presses, where olives were crushed to extract their oil. Jesus was going to be crushed tonight. John could feel it. Above them, the Passover moon shone bright and cold. Around them, the olive trees cast twisted shadows. And somewhere behind them, Judas was leading an armed contingent toward this very place. 17 hours remain. John wanted to scream, to protest, to say there had to be another way. But the words stuck in his throat because somewhere, deep in his spirit, he knew this was exactly why Jesus had come. Not to overthrow Rome, not to establish an earthly kingdom, but to die. To die so that they could live. I tell you, Jesus continued, his eyes sweeping across all of them, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine again, until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. His Father's kingdom. Not the kingdom they'd been expecting. Not thrones and crowns and political power. Something far greater, far more costly, far more glorious. Jesus began to speak then, words tumbling out as if he needed to tell them everything before it was too late. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going there to prepare a place for you. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. But John's heart was troubled, desperately troubled, because Jesus kept speaking about leaving, about going away, about them being sad but then rejoicing. And then Jesus said something that made John's blood freeze. A time is coming when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. No, John wanted to shout. We'll never leave you. But Peter had already said that, and Jesus had already predicted Peter's denial. Could it be true? Would they all abandon him? Jesus stood then and gestured toward the door. Come now, he said quietly, let us leave. The disciples gathered their cloaks, confused, uncertain. Where were they going? The night was late. Shouldn't they sleep before tomorrow? Tomorrow. Would there even be a tomorrow? Jesus led them down the stairs and into the dark streets of Jerusalem. John stayed close, so close he could hear Jesus murmuring prayers under his breath. They walked through the city gate and down into the Kidron Valley. John knew where they were going. Gethsemane, the Garden of Olive presses, where olives were crushed to extract their oil. Jesus was going to be crushed tonight. John could feel it. Above them, the Passover moon shone bright and cold. Around them, the olive trees cast twisted shadows. And somewhere behind them, Judas was leading an armed contingent toward this very place. 17 hours remain. Jesus walked a short distance away, fell on his face, and began to pray. And what he prayed was this: My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. My possible, may this cup be taken from me. This cup be taken from me. My this cup be taken from me. Me this brief. The cup of suffering, the cup of wrath, the cup of death. Jesus didn't want to drink it. For the first time, the disciples saw that their master, who had walked on water, who had raised the dead, who had commanded storms, didn't want to die. He was terrified of what was coming. But still, he prayed, Yet not as I will, but as you will. In the distance, Torches appeared on the road, dozens of them, moving toward the garden. Judas was leading them straight to Jesus. 16 hours remain, and the arrest is about to happen. In the Garden of Gethsemane, under ancient olive trees that have stood for centuries, the Son of God is experiencing something his disciples have never seen before: terror. His sweat falls to the ground like drops of blood. His prayers are desperate, agonized. He begs his Father for another way. Just meters away, his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, are falling asleep. They don't know that in less than an hour, an army will arrive with torches and swords. They don't know that their friend Judas is leading them here. They don't know that this is the last hour of freedom their master will ever have. Jesus knows, and he is praying alone. The weight of it was crushing him. Jesus pressed his face against the rocky ground of Gethsemane, his fingers digging into the earth as if trying to anchor himself to something solid. But there was nothing solid anymore. Everything was sliding toward the abyss. "Abba, Father," he gasped, using the intimate Aramaic word, the word a child uses for their papa. "Everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me." The cup. He could see it in his mind with terrible clarity. The cup of God's wrath. The cup that contained every sin ever committed, past, present, and future. Every murder, every betrayal, every act of cruelty, every moment of hatred, every whispered lie, every broken vow, all of it, waiting to be poured out on him, thus had never sinned, not once. He was pure, holy, perfect. He existed in unbroken communion with his Father, a relationship of perfect love that had existed before the foundation of the world. And tomorrow, no, today, in just hours, that communion would be shattered. His Father would turn his face away. Jesus would become sin itself. Though he knew no sin, he would be cursed. Though he was blessed, he would be forsaken, though he had never forsaken anyone. And the physical pain, the beating, the thorns, the nails, the suffocation, that was almost nothing compared to the spiritual agony of bearing the weight of humanity's evil and experiencing separation from God. "Father," Jesus prayed again, and his voice cracked, "if there is any other way." But even as he said it, he knew there wasn't. This was why he'd come. This was the mission. From the moment sin entered the world through Adam, this moment had been ordained. Every prophet had pointed to it. Every sacrifice had foreshadowed it. Every Passover lamb had been a shadow of this reality. Someone had to pay the price for sin, and Jesus had volunteered before the world began. But knowing it intellectually and facing it in reality were two entirely different things. His sweat became tinged with blood, a rare medical condition caused by extreme stress where capillaries burst under the skin. It dripped onto the ground, the first blood he would shed for humanity's redemption. Behind him, he could hear Peter, James, and John. Their breathing had slowed. They were asleep. He'd asked them for one thing: "Stay here and keep watch with me. Just watch. Just be present. Just stay awake for 1 hour." They couldn't do it. Jesus felt a wave of loneliness so profound it nearly shattered him. In his moment of greatest need, when he was about to face the most terrible ordeal in history, his closest friends were sleeping. Soon they would run. Soon they would deny him. Soon he would be completely alone, except for his Father. No, not even his Father. Because on the cross, even his Father would abandon him. my God, why have you forsaken me?" He would scream those words tomorrow, and they would be true. Complete, total, absolute abandonment, so that humanity would never have to experience it. "Yet not what I will," Jesus whispered, and these words cost him everything. "But what you will." Submission, obedience, love. Even though it would destroy him, he would do it. Because this was the only way to save the world. Jesus stood slowly, his body shaking. He walked back to his 3 disciples and found them sleeping. Peter's mouth hanging open, James curled on his side, John's hand still loosely gripping his cloak. "Simon," Jesus said softly, using Peter's old name. "Are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour?" Peter jerked awake, guilt immediately flooding his face. "Watch and pray," Jesus said gently, "so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He knew. He understood. His own flesh was weak right now, screaming at him to run, to hide, to find another way. But his spirit had made the choice. "Not my will, but yours." Jesus returned to his place of prayer and threw himself down again. The second time, he prayed the same words. The third time, he prayed them again. Each time he returned to his disciples. Each time they were asleep, and each time his resolve grew stronger. By the third prayer, something had shifted. The terror was still there. He was still fully human, still dreading what was coming. But underneath the fear was something else. Peace. The peace of complete surrender to the Father's will. "Rise!" Jesus called to his disciples, his voice stronger now. "Let us go. Here comes my betrayer." In the distance, torches bobbed through the darkness, dozens of them, coming closer. The time had come. 15 hours and 30 minutes remain. Peter scrambled to his feet, confused and disoriented. He'd been dreaming about fishing, about the Sea of Galilee, about a time when life made sense. Now Jesus was standing over him, saying something about a betrayer, and there were lights in the distance, too many lights, and voices, too many voices, and the sound of metal on metal. Swords. Someone was coming with swords. Peter's hand immediately went to his own blade, hidden in his belt. His heart pounded. This was it. The moment he'd been preparing for. Whatever was happening, he would protect Jesus. He would die for Jesus if necessary. The other disciples were waking now, stumbling to their feet, looking around in confusion and growing fear. "Lord, what's happening?" John asked, his voice tight. Jesus didn't answer. He simply stood watching the approaching mob, his face calm now, eerily calm, like a man who had just made peace with his death. The torches grew closer, and Peter could make out individual faces now. Temple guards, Roman soldiers, servants from the high priest's house, all armed, all grim-faced. Leading them was a figure Peter recognized even before he stepped into the full light. Judas. No, it couldn't be. But it was. Judas was walking ahead of the soldiers, leading them directly to Jesus, his face set like stone. "Judas," Peter breathed, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. "What are you doing?" But he knew. They all knew in that instant. The betrayer Jesus had spoken of at supper. The one who would betray him. It was Judas. Judas walked straight up to Jesus, and even now, Jesus didn't move. Didn't run, didn't fight. He simply stood there watching his friend approach. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said, and his voice was too loud, too forced. And then Judas leaned in and kissed Jesus on the cheek. The traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple, the sign of respect and affection, twisted into a signal of betrayal. "Judas," Jesus said softly, and there was such heartbreak in his voice that even the soldiers hesitated. "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" For just a moment, Judas's mask cracked. His eyes filled with something. Was it regret? Horror at what he'd done? But then the moment passed. Judas stepped back, and the soldiers moved forward. "Who is it you want?" Jesus asked, and his voice carried across the garden with unexpected authority. "Jesus of Nazareth," the captain replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And when he spoke those words, "I am," the same name God had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, something happened. The soldiers stepped back. Some stumbled. A few fell to the ground as if pushed by an invisible force. For just a moment, the divinity behind the human form blazed out, and they couldn't stand before it. But Jesus let it fade. He could have destroyed them all with a word. Could have called 12 legions of angels to his defense. Could have simply walked away through their midst. Instead, he asked again, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they repeated, recovering their courage now that the moment of power had passed. "I told you that I am he," Jesus said. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." Even in his arrest, he was protecting his disciples, but Peter wasn't going to let him be arrested without a fight. With a roar of rage and fear, Peter drew his sword and swung wildly at the nearest servant. He was aiming for the man's head, trying to kill him, but the servant jerked back at the last second. The blade caught his ear, slicing it off completely. The man screamed and fell, blood streaming down his neck. Chaos erupted. Soldiers drew their weapons. The disciples scattered, shouting. "No more of this!" Jesus commanded, and his voice cut through the chaos like a whip. Everyone froze. Jesus moved to the injured servant. Malchus was his name, a man who had probably arrested dozens of criminals and now lay bleeding at Jesus' feet. Jesus reached out and touched the bleeding wound and healed it. Completely. Instantly. The ear was restored as if it had never been cut. Even now, even in the moment of his arrest, Jesus was healing his enemies. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to Peter, and there was steel in his voice now. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Peter stood frozen, his sword dangling uselessly in his hand. Blood on the blade. The scriptures. It must happen this way. Jesus was letting himself be arrested. He was choosing this. "Am I leading a rebellion?" Jesus said to the crowd, his voice ringing with irony. "That you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." The soldiers moved forward again, more confidently now. They grabbed Jesus' arms, binding them with rope, and Jesus let them. Peter watched in horror as they tied his master's hands, the hands that had healed the sick, the hands that had multiplied loaves and fish, the hands that had reached out to pull Peter from sinking beneath the waves. tied like a common criminal. Lord, Peter started forward, but one of the soldiers pointed a sword at his chest. Run, Jesus said to all his disciples. It's all right. Run. And they did. All of them. Even Peter. They ran into the darkness of the olive groves, leaving their master in the hands of his enemies, just as he had predicted. Peter ran until his lungs burned, until he couldn't hear the shouts of the soldiers anymore. Then he collapsed against a tree, his sword still in his hand, tears streaming down his face. He'd promised to die for Jesus. Instead, he'd run away, just like Jesus said he would. 15 hours remain. John didn't run as far as the others. He couldn't. Something inside him refused to abandon Jesus completely, even if he was too terrified to stay close. So he followed at a distance, staying in the shadows, watching as the soldiers and temple guards led Jesus back toward the city. Peter was somewhere behind him. John had heard his footsteps following as well. The big fisherman couldn't stay away either, despite his fear. But the others were gone, scattered into the night like leaves before a storm. Jesus walked in the center of the armed mob, his hands bound, his head down. But even from a distance, John could see he wasn't struggling, wasn't fighting. He was going willingly to his death. Why? John's mind raced, trying to understand. Jesus could escape, could fight, could call down fire from heaven, but he was choosing this. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. How many times had Jesus said that? How many times had he tried to explain? And how many times had they refused to hear it? They'd wanted a conquering king, a political Messiah, someone who would overthrow Rome and restore Israel's glory. Instead, they got a suffering servant, a lamb led to slaughter, a king whose throne would be a cross. The procession crossed the Kidron Valley and began climbing toward the city. They were taking Jesus to Caiaphas' house. That much was clear. A trial. In the middle of the night, in violation of every Jewish law about jurisprudence. They weren't even pretending this was legitimate. John stayed in the shadows, his heart pounding so hard he thought the guards might hear it. Once, a soldier turned and looked directly at him, and John froze, certain he'd been spotted. But the soldier turned away, more focused on their prisoner than on shadows in the darkness. They reached the gate. The city walls loomed above them, and then they were inside Jerusalem, moving through empty streets toward the upper city where the high priest lived. John knew he should run, should hide, should save himself. But his feet kept moving forward, following the man he loved more than his own life, even if it meant watching him die. 14 hours and 30 minutes remain. Judas stood at the edge of the garden as the soldiers led Jesus away. He'd done it. The kiss had been given. The arrest had been made. Jesus was in custody. It was over. So why did Judas feel like he'd just torn out his own heart? He watched Jesus disappear into the darkness, bound and surrounded by armed men, and something inside Judas began to scream. What have I done? Jesus hadn't fought, hadn't resisted, hadn't even looked angry. When Judas kissed him, Jesus had simply looked sad, heartbroken, like watching a beloved child make a terrible choice and being powerless to stop it. Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? The words echoed in Judas's mind. Son of Man. Not me, not your teacher, not your friend. Son of Man. the title from Daniel's prophecy, the divine figure who would come on the clouds of heaven and be given all authority, glory, and sovereign power. Jesus had claimed that title, and Judas had just handed him over to be executed. The 30 pieces of silver suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Judas's hands shook as he reached for the money pouch at his belt. He pulled it out and stared at it in the moonlight. This is what he'd sold Jesus for. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. He'd sold the Messiah for the price of a slave. No, Judas whispered. No, no, no. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Jesus was supposed to fight back, was supposed to call down angels, was supposed to reveal himself as the conquering Messiah and overthrow their enemies. Instead, he'd healed the servant's ear, had told Peter to put away his sword, had gone willingly into the hands of those who would kill him. Jesus was going to die because of Judas. The silver coins seemed to burn through the leather pouch, scorching Judas's hand. He wanted to throw them away, wanted to run after the soldiers and tell them he'd made a mistake, wanted to undo the last 6 hours, but it was too late. The kiss had been given. Jesus was arrested. And Judas was a betrayer, the word that would define him for all eternity. Not disciple, not follower, not even failure. Betrayer. He thought about Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times by morning. At least Peter's denial would be out of fear, out of weakness. Judas's betrayal had been calculated, planned, paid for, 30 pieces of silver. He stared at the money pouch and suddenly hated it with every fiber of his being. But not as much as he hated himself. Judas began walking back toward the city, but not following Jesus. He couldn't bear to watch what happened next. Couldn't face the other disciples. Couldn't face anyone. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around him like a shroud. Somewhere in his mind, a thought began to form. A terrible final thought. If Jesus was going to die, maybe Judas should die too. 14 hours remain. In the high priest's palace, servants scrambled to light lamps and prepare the council chamber. Word had spread quickly. They'd arrested the Nazarene. The trial would begin immediately. Caiaphas stood at the window, watching torches approach. Everything was going according to plan. By morning, Jesus would be condemned. By evening, he would be dead. Gather the council, he ordered. All who can be reached at this hour. We need enough for a quorum. It was illegal to try capital cases at night. Illegal to reach a verdict in less than 2 days. Illegal to meet during Passover. But Caiaphas didn't care about legalities. He cared about results. In Mary's home across the city, she paced the floor, unable to shake the dread that had seized her heart. Something's wrong, she said to the other women who had traveled with her to Jerusalem. Something terrible is happening. How do you know? One asked. I'm his mother, Mary said simply. I know. The sword was falling. She could feel it piercing her soul, just as Simeon had prophesied 33 years ago. In the temple, the captain of the guard reported to the remaining priests on duty. We have him. Caiaphas is beginning the trial now. Any resistance? One of his followers tried to fight. Jesus healed the man he injured and ordered them all to stand down. The priest frowned. He healed someone during his own arrest? Yes, it was unusual. Unusual didn't begin to cover it. But the priests didn't want to think too deeply about what kind of man healed his enemies even as they arrested him. At the high priest's house, the soldiers dragged Jesus into the courtyard. Peter and John had managed to get inside. John because he was known to the high priest's household. Peter because John vouched for him. They stood near a fire that servants had lit against the cold night air, trying to look inconspicuous, trying not to draw attention. Peter pulled his cloak tighter around himself. The adrenaline of the garden had worn off, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and growing terror. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he run like the others? A servant girl walked past, carrying wood for the fire. She glanced at Peter, then stopped, looking closer. "You were with Jesus of Nazareth," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Peter's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice too loud. "I don't know the man." The lie came easily. Too easily. The girl shrugged and moved on, but Peter's heart was pounding. He'd just denied Jesus. For the first time. Inside the palace in the council chamber, Caiaphas stood before Jesus. "Are you the Messiah?" he demanded. "The Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus had been silent through all the false witnesses, all the contradictory testimonies, all the illegal proceedings. But now he spoke. "I am," Jesus said clearly, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The room exploded. "Blasphemy!" Caiaphas tore his robes, the traditional sign of having heard blasphemy. "Why do we need any more witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," the assembled council members shouted. "He deserves death." And then the beating began. They spit on him. They blindfolded him and struck him with their fists. "Prophesy! Who hit you?" they mocked. The Son of God stood there and took it. Outside, Peter heard the sounds of the beating and felt sick. Another servant approached him. "You're one of his disciples. I can tell by your accent you're from Galilee." "I am not," Peter said, more forcefully now. The second denial. John stood on the other side of the courtyard, watching Peter, and his heart sank. It was happening, just as Jesus had said. Inside, Jesus was being condemned. Outside, Peter was denying him. 13 hours remain, and the rooster has not yet crowed. 12 hours remain. In the high priest's palace, Jesus stands beaten and mocked, his face swelling from the blows, blood trickling from his nose and mouth. In the courtyard outside, Peter stands by the fire, trying to warm himself, trying to convince himself he's not a coward. He's denied Jesus twice. One more denial, and the prophecy will be fulfilled. The sky is still dark. Dawn is still hours away. But somewhere, a rooster is preparing to crow. And when it does, Peter's heart will shatter. Peter couldn't stop shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. He stood as close to the fire as he could without drawing attention, his hands extended toward the flames, trying to look casual. Just another servant. Just another curious onlooker. Not a disciple of the man being beaten inside. He could hear them. The council members shouting accusations. The guards, laughing as they struck Jesus. The sound of fists hitting flesh. Each sound made Peter flinch. John stood on the other side of the courtyard, trying to catch Peter's eye. But Peter couldn't look at him, couldn't face the disappointment he knew he'd see there. Peter had already denied Jesus twice. Twice he'd said, "I don't know him." The words had come so easily, too easily, as if 3 years of following Jesus, 3 years of miracles and teachings and transformation, could be erased with a simple lie. But what choice did he have? If they knew he was a disciple, they'd arrest him too, maybe kill him. Better to lie and live than tell the truth and die. Except, wasn't that exactly the opposite of what Jesus had taught? Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Peter pushed the thought away and moved closer to the fire. Maybe if he stayed quiet, kept his head down, no one else would notice him. But then a man approached, a relative of Malchus, the servant whose ear Peter had cut off in the garden. The man stared at Peter, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" the man asked, his voice loud enough that others turned to look. Peter's heart stopped. This wasn't a curious servant girl. This was someone who had been there, someone who had seen Peter draw his sword, someone who could identify him as a violent follower of the arrested man. If Peter admitted it now, he wouldn't just be associated with Jesus. He'd be guilty of attacking a servant of the high priest. Terror flooded through him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said, and his voice was too loud, too desperate. "You're one of them," another person chimed in. "I can tell by your accent. You're from Galilee like him." They were closing in. Multiple voices now, multiple accusers. Peter felt trapped, cornered, like an animal with nowhere to run. "Man, I don't know what you're saying," Peter protested. "You were in the garden," Malchus's relative insisted. "I saw you. You're the one who attacked my relative." Panic seized Peter's throat. And then, to his own horror, he began to curse, to swear oaths, to call down damnation on himself if he was lying. "I don't know the man," Peter shouted, and his voice cracked with the force of the lie. "I swear to God, I don't know him." The words hung in the air. "I don't know him." And in that exact moment, from somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness, a rooster crowed. The sound cut through the courtyard like a knife. Everything stopped. Peter froze, his hand still raised in oath, his mouth still open from the curse. The rooster crowed again. Clear, unmistakable. And then, through the doorway of the palace, Jesus appeared. The guards were moving him from one room to another, and for just a moment, Jesus and Peter made eye contact across the courtyard. Jesus' face was battered. Blood ran from his hairline. His lip was split. One eye was beginning to swell shut. But his eyes were filled with such profound sadness. Not anger, not condemnation, just heartbreak. And in that look, Peter heard Jesus' voice from just hours ago. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. 3 times. Peter had just completed the prophecy. "I will never deny you," Peter had proclaimed so confidently. "Even if all others fall away, I never will. I'm ready to die with you." And Jesus had simply looked at him with that same sad expression and said, "You will deny me 3 times." Peter had been so certain, so confident in his own loyalty, his own courage, and now he'd cursed and sworn and denied even knowing the man he'd promised to die for. The rooster crowed a 3rd time. The guards moved Jesus back inside, and he was gone from view. But Peter couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The people around him were talking, but he couldn't hear them. The fire was warm, but he couldn't feel it. The courtyard was spinning, but he couldn't steady himself. I don't know the man. The words echoed in his head like a death sentence. Peter stumbled away from the fire, pushing through the crowd, not caring now if anyone stopped him or questioned him or arrested him. He had to get out, had to get away, had to escape from the memory of Jesus' eyes looking at him with such devastating love and sorrow. Peter ran through the gate, down the street, out of the upper city. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. Then he collapsed in a dark alley and wept. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief. Peter wept with loud, wrenching sobs that came from the deepest part of his soul. He wept until he couldn't breathe, until his throat was raw, until he thought he might die from the pain of it. He'd betrayed Jesus, the man who'd called him out of his boat and given him purpose, the man who'd walked on water with him, the man who'd renamed him Peter, the Rock, because he saw potential that Peter never saw in himself, and Peter had denied him 3 times, just as Jesus said. "Simon, Simon," Jesus had said, using his old name, "Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail." Peter's faith hadn't failed. It had shattered. Somewhere in the distance he could hear the city beginning to wake. Merchants preparing for the day. Pilgrims stirring for Passover morning prayers. Life was going on as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Peter had crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd broken a vow he could never unmake. And Jesus was in the hands of men who wanted him dead. Peter curled up in the alley, his arms wrapped around himself, and continued to weep. He didn't know that Jesus had already forgiven him, that Jesus would seek him out after the resurrection, that Jesus would restore him and give him a mission that would change the world. All Peter knew right now was that he'd failed. Utterly, completely, unforgivably, or so he thought. 11 hours and 30 minutes remain. John watched Peter run from the courtyard, and his heart broke for his friend. He'd seen the whole thing, the third denial, the rooster, the look Jesus gave Peter. And now Peter was gone, swallowed by the darkness and his own shame. John wanted to follow him, wanted to comfort him, but something kept him rooted to this place. He had to stay close to Jesus, had to bear witness, had to remember everything, no matter how painful. Because if all the other disciples had scattered, if Peter had denied him, someone had to stay, someone had to see, someone had to remember, even if it cost him everything. John moved away from the fire, away from the curious servants, and found a shadowed corner where he could watch without being noticed. Inside the palace, the illegal trial continued. John could hear Caiaphas' voice, loud and angry, demanding answers. Could hear Jesus' silence in response to most questions. Silence. The lamb before its shearers was silent, just like Isaiah had prophesied 700 years ago. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. John had read that passage dozens of times, had heard Jesus quote from Isaiah 53 more than once, but he'd never understood it until now. Jesus wasn't fighting back because this was the plan. This was the purpose. This was why he'd come. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. A ransom. John thought about what that meant. A ransom was a price paid to free a prisoner, to redeem a slave, to buy back something that was lost. Jesus was paying the ransom price for humanity, with his own blood. And it was starting right now, in this illegal trial, with these false accusations and brutal beatings. John heard a commotion inside and pressed closer to the window. Through the lattice, he could see into the council chamber. They'd brought in more false witnesses. 2 men who claimed Jesus had said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Jesus had said that, John remembered. But he'd been talking about his body, not the stone temple, his death and resurrection. But the council was twisting his words, using them as evidence of blasphemy and sedition. Caiaphas stood before Jesus, his face red with frustration. "Are you not going to answer?" Caiaphas demanded. "What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" Jesus remained silent. His face was swelling now. Blood had dried on his beard. But his eyes, even beaten and humiliated, there was something in his eyes. Not defeat, not fear. Peace. Impossible, inexplicable peace. Caiaphas seemed enraged by Jesus' silence. He stepped closer, his voice rising to a shout. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The room fell silent. This was the moment. The question that mattered. The truth that would either vindicate or condemn Jesus. John held his breath. Jesus looked directly at Caiaphas, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong despite his injuries. "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The reaction was instantaneous. "Blasphemy!" Caiaphas tore his robes, the ceremonial act that signified hearing blasphemy. "Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death!" the council members shouted, and then the beating intensified. They spit on Jesus' face. They blindfolded him and struck him repeatedly. "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" John wanted to look away but couldn't. This was the man who had raised the dead, who had calmed storms, who had fed 5,000 with a few loaves and fish, and now he was allowing himself to be beaten like a common criminal. Why? Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus had said that just hours ago at the Last Supper. This was love, not the easy kind, not the comfortable kind. This was love that suffered, love that sacrificed, love that gave everything. John pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall and prayed, for Jesus, for Peter, for himself, for all of them, for the strength to keep watching when everything in him wanted to run. 11 hours remain. Judas walked through Jerusalem's streets as dawn began to break, the 30 pieces of silver clutched in his fist. He'd spent the last several hours wandering aimlessly, trying to escape his thoughts, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But the guilt was crushing him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jesus' face after the kiss, that look of profound sadness, that expression of love mixed with grief. Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Son of Man, the divine title from Daniel's prophecy, the one who would be given eternal dominion and glory, and Judas had sold him for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Judas looked down at the coins in his hand. In the growing light of dawn, they gleamed mockingly. Blood money, because that's what it was, wasn't it? Jesus was going to die, and Judas had made it possible. He'd led them right to Jesus, had identified him with a kiss, had made the arrest inevitable. And for what? For silver. For disappointment that Jesus wasn't the kind of Messiah Judas wanted? Judas felt bile rise in his throat. He'd made a terrible mistake, the worst mistake anyone could make. He had to fix it, had to make it right somehow. Judas began running toward the temple. The chief priests would be there, preparing for the morning sacrifice. Caiaphas would be there, gloating over his victory. Judas would return the money, would confess his sin, would beg them to release Jesus. Surely it wasn't too late. Surely they would listen. He burst through the temple gates as the sun crested the horizon. The morning light felt like an accusation, exposing him, revealing him for what he was, a betrayer. He found them in the temple court, Caiaphas, Annas, several chief priests and elders. They looked tired but satisfied. The trial had gone exactly as planned. "I have sinned," Judas gasped, approaching them. "I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests turned to look at him, and their expressions were cold, calculating. "I shouldn't have done it," Judas continued, his words tumbling out desperately. "He's innocent. You have to let him go. Here, take back your money." He thrust the leather pouch toward them, the 30 pieces of silver spilling onto the stone floor with a metallic clatter. The priests looked at the scattered coins, then back at Judas. "What is that to us?" Caiaphas said dismissively. "That's your responsibility." The words hit Judas like a physical blow. What is that to us? They didn't care. They'd used him to accomplish their goal, and now he was nothing to them. Less than nothing. But he's innocent," Judas protested. "I betrayed innocent blood." "That's your responsibility," another priest repeated, and they began to turn away. They were done with him. Judas stood frozen, staring at the silver scattered at his feet, the coins that had seemed so important just hours ago, the money he'd thought was compensation for his wasted 3 years. Now they looked like what they were: payment for murder. "No," Judas whispered. "No, no, no." He backed away from the coins, from the priests, from the temple. They would kill Jesus. The trial was over. The verdict was death. And nothing Judas said or did now would change that. He'd sold the Son of God for 30 pieces of silver, and the priests who'd bought that betrayal didn't care about his remorse. They'd gotten what they wanted. Judas stumbled out of the temple, his mind fracturing. He'd betrayed innocent blood. Innocent blood. Jesus had never sinned, never lied, never hurt anyone. He'd only healed, only taught, only loved, and Judas had handed him over to be executed. The weight of it was unbearable. Judas walked through Jerusalem like a ghost. People moved past him, going about their morning routines, completely unaware that the worst crime in human history had just been set in motion. And he was responsible. He passed through the city gates and kept walking, out into the valley, away from the city, away from everything. He found himself in a field, the potter's field, where they dug clay. It was empty this early in the morning, empty and silent. Judas looked up at a gnarled tree that grew at the edge of the field. Strong branches, sturdy enough. The thought that had been growing in his mind since he'd left the garden now crystallized into terrible clarity. Jesus was going to die because of Judas. Maybe Judas should die too. It seemed like justice, like the only possible atonement for what he'd done. He couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't save Jesus, couldn't face the other disciples or face himself, but he could end it. Judas pulled the rope from his belt, the same rope he'd used to secure his traveling pack. His hands shook as he fashioned it into a noose. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty field, to Jesus, to God, to himself. "I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. Judas climbed the tree. Behind him, in the temple court, the priests looked at the 30 pieces of silver scattered on the ground. "It is against the law to put this into the treasury," one of them said, "since it is blood money." After a brief discussion, they decided to use it to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. They would call it the Field of Blood. And Judas Iscariot, who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had heard his teachings and witnessed his miracles, who could have asked for forgiveness and received it. Judas chose death instead. His body would be found hours later, hanging from the tree. 30 pieces of silver had bought a field of death, and the man who'd betrayed innocent blood became its first occupant. 10 hours and 30 minutes remain. Jerusalem was waking to what should have been a joyous day. Passover, the Feast of Liberation. The celebration of God's deliverance. But in multiple places across the city, different people were experiencing this morning in vastly different ways. In the high priest's palace, servants were cleaning up from the night trial. Blood on the floor from where Jesus had been beaten. Scraps of torn cloth. The chair where he'd sat, still warm. One servant girl, the same one who'd first questioned Peter, swept the floor slowly, troubled. She'd seen the prisoner heal someone in the garden. The guards had talked about it in whispers. A man's ear completely severed, restored with a touch. What kind of criminal performed miracles while being arrested? She didn't know. But something about this whole thing felt wrong. In Mary's house, she finally rose from her knees after a night of prayer. She didn't know the specific details. Didn't know about the arrest or the trial or the beating, but she knew, with the certainty that only a mother can have, that her son was suffering. The sword Simeon had prophesied was falling. Mary began preparing to go into the city. She didn't know why or where, but she had to find him, had to be near him, even if she couldn't help. A mother's place was with her son, especially when he was in pain. In the Roman fortress, Antonia, Pontius Pilate was receiving an unexpected message. The Jewish leaders wanted an audience. Immediately. Before the morning was much older, they had a prisoner they wanted Rome to execute. Pilate groaned. He hated dealing with Jewish religious disputes. They were always complicated, always politically fraught. But he was the governor. It was his responsibility. "Tell them I'll see them within the hour," he ordered, "and find out what this is about." His servant bowed and left. Pilate's wife, still in her sleeping chamber, woke from a troubled dream. She'd been dreaming of a man, a Jewish teacher, standing before her husband. And in the dream, blood had been everywhere, on her husband's hands, on the judgment seat, on the stones of Jerusalem. have nothing to do with that innocent man. Her dream self had warned Pilate. She sat up, her heart racing. It was just a dream, just a nightmare. But it felt like more. It felt like a warning. In the temple, the morning sacrifice was being prepared. A lamb, 1 year old, without defect or blemish. Its throat would be cut at the time of the morning offering. Its blood would be poured out on the altar as atonement for sin. The priest who would perform the sacrifice that morning had no idea that the real Passover lamb was at that very moment being prepared for his own sacrifice. One lamb would die in the temple, another would die on a cross. Only one of those deaths would actually take away the sins of the world. In various homes across Jerusalem, the remaining disciples hid in fear. James and Andrew together in a locked room. Thomas alone, wondering if he should have stayed in Galilee. Matthew in the home of a former tax collector friend, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Philip and Bartholomew together, praying but not knowing what to pray for. All of them racked with guilt for having abandoned Jesus. All of them terrified they'd be arrested next. None of them knowing that in 3 days, everything would change again. And in the palace of the high priest, in a small holding cell, Jesus sat alone. His face was battered. His body ached. He'd had no sleep. But in his mind, he was counting down. 10 hours until he would hang on a cross. 7 hours until the scourging. 5 hours until Pilate would say, "Behold the man." 3 hours until he would carry his cross through Jerusalem's streets. He knew every moment that was coming, every pain, every humiliation, every second of agony. And still, he whispered the words he'd prayed in Gethsemane. "Not my will, but yours be done." The sun continued to rise over Jerusalem. Most of the city had no idea that the most significant day in human history had begun. 10 hours remain. And Jesus is being taken to Pilate. The sun is rising over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the city. Pilgrims are waking for Passover celebrations. Families are preparing for the feast. But in the fortress Antonia, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, is about to make the worst decision of his life. The Jewish leaders are bringing him a prisoner, a man they claim is a revolutionary, a threat to Caesar, a self-proclaimed king. But when Pilate looks at this beaten, silent prisoner, he sees something else entirely. He sees an innocent man. And in a few hours, Pilate will order that innocent man's execution anyway. Because politics matter more than justice. Because career matters more than conscience. Because fear matters more than truth. 8 hours remain. And the world is about to witness the most unjust trial in human history. Pontius Pilate stood on the raised platform of the Praetorium, looking down at the crowd of Jewish leaders gathered in the courtyard below. They wouldn't enter the Praetorium itself, some religious scruple about Gentile buildings during Passover. So they stood outside, shouting up at him like merchants haggling in the marketplace. Pilate hated them. He hated their religious complexities, their endless rules, their thinly veiled contempt for Roman authority, their political games, and he especially hated being dragged out of bed before dawn to deal with their internal squabbles. "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Pilate called down. Caiaphas stepped forward, his face set in righteous indignation. "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate's jaw tightened. They wanted him to rubber stamp their verdict without even hearing the case. "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law," Pilate replied coldly. "But we have no right to execute anyone," Caiaphas said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. They needed Rome to do their dirty work. Pilate gestured for the prisoner to be brought forward. The man they led up the steps was unexpected. Pilate had judged hundreds of criminals during his decade as governor. Murderers, thieves, rebels, zealots. He knew the look of a dangerous man. This prisoner didn't have that look. He was young, perhaps 33 years old. His face was battered and swollen from an obvious beating. Blood had dried in his beard. His hands were bound. But his eyes were clear, calm, almost serene. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, using the charge the priests had mentioned. The prisoner looked directly at him. "Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me?" Pilate felt a flash of surprise. This man wasn't cowering, wasn't begging. He was engaging in philosophical dialogue like a teacher with a student. "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied irritably. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" "My kingdom is not of this world," Jesus said quietly. "If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "Not of this world." Pilate studied the prisoner's face. He'd dealt with self-proclaimed messiahs before. Delusional zealots who thought they could overthrow Rome through violence. But this man spoke of a different kind of kingdom entirely. "You are a king, then," Pilate said. "You say that I am a king," Jesus replied. "In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Truth. Pilate almost laughed. He was a Roman politician. He knew there was no such thing as absolute truth, only power, expediency, and survival. "What is truth?" Pilate asked, his voice dripping with cynicism. Jesus simply looked at him, and for a moment, Pilate felt uncomfortably exposed, as if this beaten prisoner could see straight through him. Pilate turned away and went back out to the Jewish leaders. "I find no basis for a charge against him," he announced. It was the truth. Whatever religious dispute they had with this man, it wasn't Rome's concern. He posed no threat to Caesar. But the crowd erupted in protest. "He stirs up the people," one priest shouted. "He teaches all over Judea, from Galilee to here." Galilee. Pilate seized on the word like a drowning man grasping a rope. "This man is a Galilean?" he asked. When they confirmed it, Pilate felt a surge of relief. Galilee was Herod Antipas's jurisdiction. Herod was in Jerusalem for Passover. Perfect. "Take him to Herod," Pilate ordered. "He has authority over Galileans." It was a coward's move, and Pilate knew it. He was passing off a difficult decision to someone else. But right now, he didn't care. Let Herod deal with this mess. As the soldiers led Jesus away, Pilate went back inside. His wife was waiting for him, her face pale. "I had a dream about that man," she said urgently. "Don't have anything to do with him. He is innocent." Pilate waved her away. "It's handled. I sent him to Herod." But even as he said it, he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. 7 hours and 30 minutes remain. John followed at a distance as the soldiers led Jesus through Jerusalem's streets toward Herod's palace. The city was waking now. Merchants opening shops, pilgrims emerging for morning prayers, children running through the streets. Normal life, carrying on as if the Son of God wasn't being marched to his death. John had stayed close all night, through the trial at Caiaphas's house, through the transfer to Pilate, and now, following to Herod. He was exhausted, terrified, But he couldn't leave. Someone had to witness this. Someone had to remember. As they walked, people began to notice. Some recognized Jesus. He'd taught in Jerusalem many times. "Isn't that the healer?" one woman whispered. "The one who raised Lazarus," another asked. "What's happened to him?" Word spread quickly in Jerusalem. By the time they reached Herod's palace, a small crowd had begun to follow. John heard fragments of conversation. "They arrested him last night. They say he claimed to be the Messiah." Herod Antipas had been hoping to meet Jesus of Nazareth for years. The miracle worker, the prophet, the man who supposedly raised the dead and multiplied loaves. Herod had heard countless stories. Some said Jesus was John the Baptist risen from the dead, which had troubled Herod deeply, since he'd been the one who ordered John's execution. But now, finally, here was Jesus, delivered right to his doorstep. Herod leaned forward on his throne, studying the prisoner with fascination. He looked ordinary, beaten, bloodied, nothing special. Certainly not like someone who could perform miracles. "So," Herod said, his voice jovial, "you're the famous Jesus of Nazareth. I've been wanting to meet you." Jesus said nothing. "I've heard remarkable things about you," Herod continued. "They say you turn water into wine, that you walk on water, that you command demons." Still nothing. Herod's smile began to fade. "I'd like to see a miracle. Can you do that for me? Just one little miracle?" Jesus stood silent, his eyes fixed on some point beyond Herod. "Come now," Herod cajoled. "Surely you can manage something? Heal one of my servants? Make something float? Predict the future?" Nothing. Herod felt irritation rising. He was the Tetrarch of Galilee. He had power, authority, and this peasant was refusing to even acknowledge him. "The chief priests tell me you claim to be a king," Herod said, his voice hardening. "Is that true? Are you a king?" Silence. "They say you perform miracles. Prove it. Show me." Still nothing. Herod stood and walked closer to Jesus, circling him like a predator studying prey. "You know," Herod said conversationally, "I killed John the Baptist. Did you know that? He kept telling me I was living in sin, marrying my brother's wife, so I cut off his head." He waited for a reaction. Fear, anger, something. But Jesus simply stood there, silent as stone. And in that moment, Herod realized something that chilled him. Jesus wasn't silent because he was afraid or defiant. He was silent because Herod didn't matter. This prisoner, this beaten and bloodied man, looked at Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, the son of Herod the Great, and saw him as insignificant, not worth speaking to. Realization enraged Herod more than defiance would have. "Nothing to say?" Herod shouted. "No prophecies? No rebukes? No miracles?" Jesus' eyes met his for just a moment, and Herod saw something in them that made him step back. Not hatred, not fear. Pity. This prisoner pitied him. "He's mad," Herod announced to his court. "Delusional, not dangerous, just pathetic." He gestured to his soldiers. "Put a robe on him, a royal robe. If he wants to be a king, let's make him look like one." They brought a gorgeous purple robe, expensive, ornate, the kind a king would wear, and draped it mockingly over Jesus' shoulders. The contrast was absurd. The beaten face, the bound hands, the blood, all dressed up in royal finery. Herod's court laughed. They mocked Jesus, asked him to prophesy, demanded miracles, made jokes about his kingdom. And through it all, Jesus remained silent. Finally, Herod tired of the game. "Send him back to Pilate," he ordered. "Tell the governor I find no basis for the charges against him, but let him deal with it. I want nothing to do with this." Another coward's move, another powerful man passing off responsibility. As the soldiers led Jesus away, still wearing the purple robe, Herod felt oddly unsettled. He'd wanted to see a miracle. Instead, he'd seen something far more disturbing. He'd seen a man who knew he was going to die, and was choosing not to fight it. What kind of king does that? 6 hours and 30 minutes remain. When they brought Jesus back to Pilate, still wearing Herod's mocking purple robe, the governor felt his brief hope of avoiding this decision die. Herod had found no basis for charges either, which meant the responsibility fell back on Pilate. He looked at Jesus, standing silently in that ridiculous royal garment, and felt something he rarely experienced: guilt. This man was innocent. Pilate knew it. His wife knew it. Herod knew it. Even the crowd knew it, though they wouldn't admit it. But the Jewish leaders wanted him dead, and they had ways of making Pilate's life very difficult if he didn't cooperate. Pilate went back out to the courtyard, where the crowd had grown larger. More priests, more elders, and now, ordinary people drawn by the spectacle. "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion," Pilate called out. "I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, who sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death." The crowd murmured. "Therefore," Pilate continued, "I will punish him and then release him." It was a compromise. A few lashes to satisfy their anger, then let him go. Unjust, but politically expedient. But then Caiaphas stepped forward again. "We have a petition," he said loudly. "According to your custom, you release one prisoner during Passover. We have a request." Pilate felt a sinking sensation. He knew where this was going. "Release Barabbas," someone in the crowd shouted. Others took up the cry. "Barabbas! Give us Barabbas!" Pilate's jaw clenched. Barabbas was a notorious criminal, a murderer, a rebel who had actually participated in an insurrection against Rome. Everything the Jews falsely accused Jesus of, Barabbas had actually done. But what about this man? Pilate pointed to Jesus. "What shall I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" "Crucify him!" the crowd shouted. The speed of it shocked Pilate. Yesterday, this man had entered Jerusalem to crowds shouting, "Hosanna!" Today, the same city was screaming for his execution. Why? Pilate demanded. What crime has he committed? But they only shouted louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate looked at Jesus, still standing silent in that purple robe. Why didn't he defend himself? Why didn't he speak? "Are you not going to answer?" Pilate asked him privately. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus looked at him, and when he spoke, his voice was calm. "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." The words struck Pilate like a blow. This prisoner was telling him that his power, Roman power, Caesar's power, only existed because God allowed it. And yet, Jesus was choosing to submit to that power anyway. From then on, Pilate tried desperately to set Jesus free. He argued with the crowd. He pointed out the innocents. He offered compromises. But the Jewish leaders played their final card. "If you let this man go," Caiaphas called out, "you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." The threat was clear. If Pilate released Jesus, they would report him to Rome, would claim he was tolerating sedition, would destroy his career. And Pilate loved his career more than he loved justice. He called for a basin of water, stood before the crowd, and performed an act that would define him for all of history. He washed his hands. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "It is your responsibility." The crowd roared back, "His blood is on us and on our children." It was done. Pilate gave the order, "Release Barabbas. Take Jesus away and crucify him." A murderer went free. An innocent man was condemned to death. And Pilate told himself he'd done what he had to do. But as they led Jesus away to be scourged, Pilate looked at his hands, freshly washed, but somehow still feeling stained. His wife had been right. He should have had nothing to do with this innocent man. But it was too late now. 6 hours remain. The news spread through Jerusalem like wildfire. Jesus of Nazareth had been condemned. He would be crucified. Today, in just hours, different people received this news in vastly different ways. In Caiaphas's house, the high priest allowed himself a smile of satisfaction. It was done. The Nazarene was condemned. By evening, the threat would be eliminated. Order would be restored. The fact that they'd had to free Barabbas, a genuine criminal, to accomplish it didn't trouble Caiaphas at all. One life for the good of the nation. It was a small price to pay. He had no idea that this small price would be remembered as the greatest sacrifice in history. In a locked room across the city, the remaining disciples received the news from a sympathetic merchant. "They're going to crucify him," the man said quietly. "Pilate condemned him. It's happening today." James and Andrew stared at each other in horror. Thomas put his head in his hands. Matthew wept. "We should do something," one of them said weakly. "We should." But what could they do? They were fishermen and tax collectors against the combined might of the Sanhedrin and Rome. They'd already tried fighting in the garden. Peter had drawn his sword, and Jesus had told him to put it away. The crown of thorns, woven from the branches of a local thorn bush, each spine 2 inches long. The crossbeam, weighing perhaps 75 to 100 pounds, that the condemned would carry. The nails, long iron spikes that would be driven through wrists and feet. Just another execution, just another day's work. They had no idea they were preparing to crucify the Creator of the universe. And in the cell where Jesus waited, he prayed one final time before the torture began. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." He was praying for Caiaphas, who thought he was protecting the nation. For Pilate, who thought he was protecting his career. For the disciples, who had run away in fear. For Peter, who was somewhere weeping in shame. For the soldiers who were about to beat him. For the crowd that had screamed for his death. For Judas, who had just hanged himself in a field. For all of them. For all of us. Father, forgive them. The sun climbed higher in the sky. 5 hours remain. And the scourging is about to begin. 4 hours remain. What happens in these next 4 hours will be so brutal, so savage, that witnesses will turn away in horror. The Roman scourging is designed to bring a man to the edge of death without killing him. 39 lashes with a flagrum, a whip embedded with bone and metal that tears flesh from bone. Then the crown of thorns, 2-inch spikes driven into the skull. Then the crossbeam, 75 pounds of wood that must be carried through Jerusalem's streets. Jesus of Nazareth has already been beaten, mocked, and condemned. Now comes the physical destruction, the breaking of the body that will save the world. 4 hours remain, and hell itself seems to have been unleashed upon the Son of God. They tied Jesus to a post in the courtyard of the Praetorium. His hands were bound above his head, his back exposed. The purple robe had been torn away. The soldiers who would perform the scourging were professionals. They'd done this hundreds of times. It was a science to them, how to inflict maximum pain without killing the prisoner too quickly. The flagrum was brought out, multiple leather strands, each about 3 feet long. At the end of each strand, pieces of bone and jagged metal, some shaped like small hooks. 39 lashes. No more, according to Jewish law. But the Romans had perfected the art of making 39 lashes feel like 1,000. The first soldier took his position. He swung. The flagrum struck Jesus' back with a sound like wet canvas tearing. The metal pieces bit into flesh. The bone fragments scraped across skin. When the soldier pulled back, the hooks caught and tore. Jesus' body jerked, his hands clenched around the ropes, but he made no sound. The second lash fell, then the third. By the 5th lash, Jesus' back was already bleeding. By the 10th, strips of flesh were hanging loose. By the 15th, muscle tissue was visible. The soldier's arm grew tired. A second soldier took over. Fresh strength, fresh brutality. 20, 25, 30. Jesus' legs buckled. Only the ropes around his wrists kept him upright. His back was no longer recognizable as human skin. It was a mass of torn flesh, exposed muscle, and flowing blood. 35, 36. The prophet Isaiah had written about this moment 700 years earlier. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. 37, 38. Finally, 39. The soldier stepped back, breathing hard from the exertion. Jesus hung from the post, his body trembling, his back destroyed. But he was still conscious, still alive, because this was only the beginning. They cut him down, and he collapsed to the stone floor, landing on the shredded remains of his back. The pain must have been unimaginable, and yet, from Jesus' lips came words that no tortured man should be capable of speaking. "Father, forgive them." The soldiers stared at him. What kind of man prays for his torturers? But they didn't have time to ponder it. They had more to do. Someone suggested a crown, a mock coronation for this king of the Jews. They found branches from a thorn bush, the kind with long, thick spikes. They wove them into a crude circle. Then they pressed it onto Jesus' head. The thorns, some 2 inches long, pierced his scalp, his forehead, his temples. Blood ran down his face, into his eyes, his beard. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they mocked, bowing before him in exaggerated reverence. They spit on him. They struck him across the face with a staff, driving the thorns deeper. They put a reed in his hand like a scepter, then snatched it away and beat him with it. They dressed him in a scarlet robe, another mockery of royalty, and paraded him before each other, laughing. Jesus stood through it all, swaying, bleeding, barely able to stand, but standing. A centurion watched from the edge of the courtyard, his face troubled. He'd seen many men scourged in his years of service. Some begged, some cursed, some screamed until their voices gave out. This one prayed for his torturers. The centurion filed that observation away. It would matter later, when darkness covered the land and the earth shook beneath his feet. 3 hours and 30 minutes remain. Pilate stood on the judgment seat as they brought Jesus out. "Exe homo," Pilate announced to the crowd. "Behold the man." He hoped this would be enough, hoped that seeing Jesus in this condition, beaten, bloodied, wearing a crown of thorns and a scarlet robe, would satisfy the crowd's bloodlust. Surely they could see he'd already been punished. Surely this was sufficient. But when the crowd saw Jesus, they didn't fall silent in pity. They screamed louder, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate felt his last hope die. "You take him and crucify him," he said weakly. "As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." "We have a law," the Jewish leaders shouted back, "and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." Son of God. The words sent a chill through Pilate. He'd been dealing with this as a political problem. But what if this prisoner really was something more than human? Pilate went back inside and faced Jesus again. "Where do you come from?" he asked urgently. Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said, his voice rising. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus looked at him with eyes that saw straight through to Pilate's soul. "You would have no power over me," Jesus said quietly, "if it were not given to you from above." And in that moment, Pilate realized he wasn't judging this prisoner. This prisoner was judging him. Pilate went back outside and made one final attempt. "Here is your king," he said to the crowd. "Take him away," they screamed. "Crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," Caiaphas shouted. The ultimate irony. The high priest of Israel declaring loyalty to a pagan emperor rather than acknowledging the true king standing before him. Pilate called for the water basin again. He'd already washed his hands once, but he felt compelled to do it again, as if water could wash away what he was about to do. "Crucify him," Pilate ordered. The soldiers moved forward to take Jesus away. Pilate turned and walked back into his palace, unable to watch what came next. His wife's words echoed in his mind. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man." But he'd had everything to do with him. He'd condemned him. And that condemnation would haunt Pilate for the rest of his life. History would remember him for one thing only. He sentenced Jesus Christ to death. 3 hours remain. Mary pushed through the crowd, John gripping her arm to keep her from being separated in the chaos. She'd heard the shouts of "Crucify" from blocks away, had felt each scream like a knife to her heart. Now she needed to see him, needed to be near him. Even if she couldn't save him, she could be present, could let him know he wasn't alone. They reached the Praetorium courtyard, just as the soldiers were bringing Jesus out. Mary's breath caught in her throat. She'd prepared herself. She'd thought she was ready. But nothing could have prepared her for this. This wasn't her son. This couldn't be her son. This was barely recognizable as human. The face she'd kissed as a baby, swollen and bruised beyond recognition. The hands she'd held as a child, now bound and bleeding. The back she'd patted when he was sick, now shredded to ribbons. The head she'd stroked when he couldn't sleep, now crowned with thorns that had turned his face into a mask of blood. "No," Mary whispered, and the word was torn from somewhere deep in her soul. "No, no, no." John held her up as her legs threatened to give way. Jesus was looking out at the crowd, and for just a moment, his eyes met hers. And in that look, Mary saw everything. She saw the boy who'd learned carpentry from Joseph. She saw the young man who'd performed his first miracle at Cana. She saw the teacher who'd gathered children on his lap. She saw the healer who'd wept at Lazarus's tomb. And she saw something else. Something that made her heart break and soar at the same time. She saw purpose. He was choosing this. Her son was choosing this. Why? Why would he choose torture and death? But even as she asked the question, she remembered. She remembered the angel's words 33 years ago. He will save his people from their sins. She remembered Simeon's prophecy. A sword will pierce your own soul too. She remembered her son's words just days ago. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. The third day. He'd said the third day. Mary clung to those words like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The third day. He would rise on the third day. But first, he had to die, and she had to watch. The soldiers began moving Jesus toward the gate, toward the road that led out of the city, toward Golgotha. Mary followed. John tried to hold her back. "Mary, you don't have to see this. Let me take you somewhere safe." "My place is with my son," Mary said, and her voice was steel wrapped in tears. "I brought him into this world. I won't abandon him as he leaves it." They joined the procession of death. Jesus, barely able to walk, stumbling forward. Two other condemned men, actual criminals, being led out with him. Soldiers surrounding them, keeping the crowd back, and behind them, a mother following her son to his execution. The sword Simeon prophesied was piercing her soul, but she would not look away. 2 hours and 45 minutes remain. They made Jesus carry the crossbeam himself. It was Roman practice. Make the condemned carry the instrument of his own execution. A final humiliation. The beam weighed perhaps 75 pounds. For a healthy man, it would be difficult. For a man who'd just endured 39 lashes and hadn't slept or eaten in over 24 hours, it was nearly impossible. John watched as they laid the heavy wooden beam across Jesus' shoulders, pressing it against the raw flesh of his scourged back. Jesus staggered under the weight, but managed to take a step, then another. The procession began moving toward the gate, through Jerusalem's streets, past the crowds who'd shouted, "Hosanna," just 5 days ago. Now some of those same people lined the route, but they weren't cheering. Some wept, some turned away, some watched with cruel satisfaction. Jesus made it perhaps 100 yards before he fell. The beam crashed down, and Jesus collapsed under it, his face hitting the stone street. The soldiers cursed and yanked him to his feet. "Get up!" they shouted. "Move!" Jesus tried. He got to his knees, tried to lift the beam, but his strength was gone. His body had been pushed beyond human endurance. He fell again. John felt tears streaming down his face. He wanted to rush forward, to carry the beam himself, but the soldiers would never allow it. Jesus fell a third time. Now the soldiers were getting concerned. If he died before they could crucify him, it would ruin their mourning. They needed him alive when they nailed him to the cross. A centurion looked around and spotted a man in the crowd, a broad-shouldered man from North Africa. "You," the centurion ordered, "carry his beam." The man, Simon from Cyrene, who'd come to Jerusalem for Passover and found himself conscripted into the most significant moment in history, stepped forward reluctantly. He lifted the beam from Jesus' shoulders. The relief on Jesus' face was visible, even through the blood and bruising. They continued walking. John and Mary kept pace behind them, close enough to see but not close enough to touch. Women from Jerusalem lined the streets, weeping loudly. It was customary. Professional mourners who wailed at executions. But their grief seemed genuine this time. Jesus stopped and turned to them. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he said, and his voice was rough but clear. "Do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Even now, even carrying his cross to his death, he was thinking of others, warning them, caring for them. A woman broke through the crowd. Veronica, brave and compassionate. She held out a cloth. "For your face, Rabbi," she said softly. Jesus paused and she gently wiped the blood and sweat from his face. When she pulled the cloth away, his image remained imprinted on it. A gift, though she didn't know it yet. A relic that would be treasured for centuries. The soldiers pushed Jesus forward. They were approaching the city gate now. Beyond it, a small hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, where 3 crosses were already being erected. John looked at Jesus, struggling to put one foot in front of the other, and marveled. This was the man who'd walked on water, who'd calmed storms with a word, who'd raised the dead. And now he could barely walk, but he was walking. Step by agonizing step, Jesus was walking toward his own execution. Because this was why he'd come. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. John had heard Jesus say those words, had written them down, but he'd never fully understood them until this moment. This was love. Not the easy kind, not the comfortable kind. This was love that bled, love that suffered, love that died, so that the world could live. They passed through the gate. Golgotha loomed ahead, dark and ominous against the midday sky. 2 hours remain. The small hill called Golgotha stood just outside Jerusalem's walls. It was called the Place of the Skull. Some said because the rock formation resembled a skull. Others because it was where Rome executed criminals, leaving their bones to bleach in the sun. 3 crosses had been prepared, wooden posts already planted in the ground. 3 crossbeams waiting to be lifted and attached. Jesus arrived first, Simon of Cyrene still carrying his beam. The 2 criminals came behind him. Thieves, the guards said. Men who'd actually committed the crimes Jesus was accused of. A crowd had already gathered. Some came to mourn, some came to mock. Some came simply because executions were public spectacles in Roman Jerusalem. Mary, John, and a few other women who'd followed Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Salome, Mary the wife of Clopas, stood at a distance, as close as the soldiers would allow. The priests and elders were there too, unable to resist watching their victory. Caiaphas stood with his arms crossed, satisfaction on his face. This was it. The end of the Nazarene, the end of the threat. By sunset, Jesus would be dead, and order would be restored. The soldiers offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a mild narcotic meant to dull the pain. Jesus tasted it and refused to drink. He would face this fully conscious, would feel every moment of it, would bear humanity's sin while completely aware. They laid the crossbeam on the ground and forced Jesus down onto it. John turned Mary away. "You don't need to see this part," he whispered. But Mary heard it. She heard the hammer strike. Once, twice, 3 times, driving the iron spike through her son's wrist, then the other wrist. She heard Jesus gasp in pain, the first sound of suffering he'd allowed himself to make. She heard the soldiers grunt with effort as they lifted the crossbeam and attached it to the vertical post, already planted in the ground. She heard them nail his feet, and then it was done. Jesus of Nazareth hung on a cross between 2 criminals. The King of the Jews, executed like a common criminal. The Son of God, dying like a mortal man. The Savior of the world, crucified by the world he came to save. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The priests protested. Don't write the King of the Jews, they complained. Write that he claimed to be King of the Jews. But Pilate, finding one last shred of spine, refused. What I have written, I have written. The sign would stay, telling the truth that everyone refused to see. This broken, bleeding, dying man was a king. The sun reached its zenith in the sky. Noon. Jesus had been on the cross for less than 30 minutes. He had 3 more hours to go. 1 hour remains until the darkness falls, and the real suffering is about to begin. 1 hour remains, but it won't be an ordinary hour. In 60 minutes, the light of the world will die in supernatural darkness. In 60 minutes, the temple veil will tear from top to bottom. In 60 minutes, the earth will shake and rocks will split. In 60 minutes, Jesus of Nazareth will speak his final words and breathe his last breath. And nothing, absolutely nothing, will ever be the same. This is the hour that separates all of human history into before and after. This is the hour when God's wrath against sin is poured out. This is the hour when heaven and hell watch in silence. This is the hour of the cross. 60 minutes remain. Jesus hung between heaven and earth, his body screaming with agony from 1,000 wounds. Every breath was torture. To breathe, he had to push up on the nails through his feet, scraping his scourged back against rough wood, pulling against the nails in his wrists. Each breath was a choice to keep living, a choice to keep suffering, so that humanity could breathe freely forever. Below him, the soldiers were gambling for his clothes, rolling dice for his seamless tunic, dividing his other garments among themselves, fulfilling prophecy without knowing it. Father, Jesus prayed, his voice rough but clear, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. The soldiers paused, looking up at him. What kind of man prays for the people executing him? But Jesus wasn't just praying for the soldiers. He was praying for Caiaphas, who'd orchestrated his death, for Pilate, who'd condemned him out of political cowardice, for Judas, who'd betrayed him with a kiss, for Peter, who'd denied him 3 times, for the crowd that had screamed, "Crucify," for every human being who would ever sin, for you, for me, for all of us. Father, forgive them. One of the criminals hanging beside Jesus, a thief who'd lived a life of violence and crime, was mocking him. Aren't you the Messiah? He sneered. Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God? He said. We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he turned his head toward Jesus, and in his eyes was something that hadn't been there an hour ago. Faith. Jesus, he said quietly, remember me when you come into your kingdom." In that moment, dying on a cross, this criminal did what the priests and Pharisees refused to do. He recognized who Jesus was. Jesus turned his head toward him, and despite the pain, despite the agony, he smiled. "Truly I tell you," Jesus said, "today you will be with me in paradise." Today, not someday, not after centuries of purgatory or judgment. Today. The thief had lived his entire life in rebellion against God, but in his final hour, he believed. And that was enough. Grace, pure, unmerited, scandalous grace, was extended to a dying criminal. The first person to enter heaven after Jesus' sacrifice would be a thief who did nothing to earn it except believe. That's the gospel. Through the crowd, Jesus could see his mother. Mary stood with John, her face a mask of controlled anguish. Every mother's worst nightmare was playing out before her eyes, but she was still there, still present, still loving him even as she watched him die. Jesus' throat was parched, his voice weakening, but he needed to do this. "Woman," he said, using a term of respect, not distance, "behold your son." He looked at John. "Behold your mother." He was making provision for her. Joseph was long dead. Jesus' half-brothers didn't yet believe in him. Mary would need someone. And John, young, faithful John who'd stayed when everyone else ran, would care for her. From that moment on, John took Mary into his home. Even dying, Jesus was thinking of others. Even in agony, he was making sure his mother would be cared for. Then, without warning, the sky began to darken. It wasn't nightfall. It was only midday. It wasn't a solar eclipse. Those last minutes, not hours, and don't occur during Passover's full moon. This was something else entirely. Supernatural darkness descended over the land like a thick blanket being pulled across the sky. The crowd gasped. Some screamed. Some fell to their knees. Even the soldiers looked up nervously, hands moving to their sword hilts as if darkness were an enemy they could fight. For 3 hours, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. What was happening in that darkness? The Bible gives us glimpses. Jesus, who had never sinned, was becoming sin itself. Jesus, who had existed in perfect communion with the Father from eternity past, was experiencing separation from God. The cup he'd prayed about in Gethsemane, the cup of God's wrath against sin, was being poured out. Not on humanity, who deserved it, but on Jesus, who didn't. Every sin ever committed, every act of rebellion, every moment of hatred, lust, greed, pride, violence. The accumulated weight of human evil was being placed on him. And the Father, who cannot look upon sin, was turning his face away. As the darkness reached its peak, Jesus cried out. Not quietly, not peacefully. He cried out with a loud voice that echoed across Golgotha. "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" It was the opening line of Psalm 22, a prophetic psalm that described crucifixion in detail, written 1,000 years before crucifixion was even invented. But it was also genuine agony. For the first and only time in all of eternity, the Son was separated from the Father. The Trinity, united in perfect love and communion since before time began, was being torn apart by human sin. Jesus wasn't just experiencing physical death. He was experiencing spiritual death, separation from God, the very thing that every human being deserves as the wages of sin. He was taking our place, bearing our punishment, drinking the cup of wrath so we would never have to. Some in the crowd misunderstood. "He's calling for Elijah," one said, but others knew better. They heard the anguish, the abandonment, the cost. Jesus' throat was completely parched now. He'd lost massive amounts of blood. His body was shutting down from dehydration and trauma. "I thirst," he said. Just 2 words. But they fulfilled another prophecy. "They gave me vinegar for my thirst." A soldier soaked a sponge in sour wine and lifted it to Jesus' lips on a hyssop branch. Hyssop, the same plant used to apply lamb's blood to doorposts during the first Passover in Egypt. Even the smallest details were screaming, "This is the Lamb." Jesus took the wine into his mouth. Jesus gathered what remained of his strength. He pushed up on the nails one final time, took a deep breath, and shouted. Not weakly, not as a whimper of defeat, but as a declaration of victory. "Tetelestai!" It is finished. In Greek, tetelestai was stamped on bills when they were paid in full. It was written on contracts when obligations were complete. It was proclaimed by artists when their masterpiece was complete. It is finished, not "I am finished," not "I give up." But the work is complete. The debt is paid. The sacrifice is accepted. Salvation is accomplished. Every prophecy about the Messiah's suffering fulfilled. Every requirement of the law satisfied. Every sin of humanity atoned for. The price of redemption paid in full. It is finished. With his final breath, Jesus spoke one last time. His voice was softer now, but full of trust. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He'd been forsaken so we would never be. Now he was going home. The separation was over. The work was complete. And Jesus, having endured the cross, having despised the shame, having drunk the cup of wrath, released his spirit. He died. Not because the Romans killed him, not because his body gave out, but because he chose to lay down his life. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. The Creator of the universe died. The Lamb of God was slain. The Son of God breathed his last. It was 3 p.m. on Friday. 0 hours remain, and the world would never be the same. At the exact moment Jesus died, in the temple in Jerusalem, something impossible happened. The veil, the massive curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, suddenly tore, from top to bottom. Not bottom to top, as if human hands had torn it, but top to bottom. God himself ripping it in two. This wasn't a small curtain. Historical records say it was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and 4 inches thick. So heavy it took 300 priests to move it. Josephus wrote that it was so strong that teams of oxen pulling in opposite directions couldn't tear it. But it tore, in an instant, completely, irreparably. The priests who were in the temple for the afternoon sacrifice stumbled backward in shock. The Holy of Holies, the place where only the high priest could enter, only once a year, only with blood, was now exposed. The barrier between God and humanity had been removed. The way to the Father was now open, because the final sacrifice had been made. At Golgotha, as Jesus died, the earth shook. Not a gentle tremor. A violent earthquake that split rocks and opened tombs. The centurion who'd overseen the crucifixion, who'd watched Jesus all day, heard his words, witnessed his death, stood in the midst of the shaking earth and falling rocks. And he declared what no one expected a Roman soldier, to say, "Surely this was the Son of God," or as Luke records it, "Surely this was a righteous man." This hardened military man, who'd crucified countless criminals, recognized what the priests refused to see. The man on the center cross wasn't a blasphemer. He was exactly who he claimed to be. According to Matthew's Gospel, something even more extraordinary happened. When Jesus died, tombs broke open. And after Jesus' resurrection, many holy people who had died were raised to life. The first fruits of resurrection, a preview of what Jesus would accomplish. Death itself was being defeated. Mary stood at the foot of the cross, supported by John and the other women. She'd watched her son die. She'd heard every word, seen every breath, felt every moment of his suffering. The sword Simeon had prophesied had pierced her soul completely. But in her grief, something else stirred. Hope. She remembered his words. The third day. She didn't understand it, couldn't comprehend how death could be followed by life. But she chose to believe. Because if anyone understood impossible births, it was Mary. She'd given birth to the Son of God as a virgin. If God could do that, couldn't he raise his son from the dead? The third day, Mary whispered to John. He said the third day. John squeezed her hand. He didn't understand either, but they would. In just over 60 hours, they would understand everything. The earthquake and darkness had broken the crowd's bloodlust. People who'd come to mock left beating their breasts in grief and fear. They'd witnessed something far beyond a simple execution. The priests left too, satisfaction turning to unease in their stomachs. Why had the earth shaken at his death? Why had darkness covered the land? What did any of it mean? But they pushed the questions away. He was dead. That's what mattered. They didn't know that death was about to be defeated. As evening approached, and with it the Sabbath, two unlikely men stepped forward. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin, a secret disciple who hadn't agreed with the council's decision to condemn Jesus. Nicodemus was the Pharisee who'd come to Jesus by night 3 years earlier, asking, "How can a man be born again?" Both had been too afraid to stand with Jesus publicly while he was alive. Now, with Jesus dead, they found courage. Joseph went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate, surprised Jesus had died so quickly, crucifixion usually took days, verified with the centurion and granted the request. Joseph and Nicodemus went to Golgotha as the sun was setting. The other two criminals were still alive, so soldiers broke their legs, causing them to suffocate quickly since they could no longer push up to breathe. But Jesus was already dead. To be certain, a soldier thrust a spear into his side. Blood and water flowed out, medical evidence that his heart had ruptured, that the pericardial sac had filled with fluid. He was definitely dead. Joseph and Nicodemus carefully removed the nails and took Jesus' body down from the cross. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, Salome, and the other women watched, weeping. They wrapped his body in strips of linen with 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, a burial fit for a king. Joseph had a new tomb, cut from rock, in a garden near Golgotha. He'd probably intended it for himself or his family, but he gave it to Jesus. They laid his body on the stone shelf inside the tomb. Then they rolled a massive stone across the entrance, a stone so large it would normally take several men to move. The women noted where he was buried, planning to return after the Sabbath to anoint his body properly with more spices. Then they left. As darkness fell, the tomb was sealed. Inside lay the body of Jesus of Nazareth, dead, cold, still. The disciples were scattered, hiding, convinced that everything they'd believed in had died on that cross. The priests were satisfied. The threat was eliminated. Satan thought he'd won. But Sunday was coming. 24 hours earlier, Jesus had gathered with his disciples for the Last Supper. He'd washed their feet, broken bread, poured wine. He'd known with perfect clarity, everything that was coming, and he'd chosen it anyway. Now he lay dead in a tomb. But death could not hold him. Saturday, the day between Saturday, was the Sabbath, a day of enforced rest for the Jews. The disciples hid in locked rooms, paralyzed by fear and grief. Peter wept alone somewhere, destroyed by his denial. Mary mourned the son she'd carried, nursed, raised, and now buried. But in the realm of the dead, something extraordinary was happening. 1 Peter 3:19 tells us that Jesus went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. While his body lay in the tomb, his spirit was declaring victory in the place of the dead. Before dawn on Sunday, the third day, just as Jesus had promised, something happened in that sealed tomb. Life returned, not resuscitation, not near death reversed. Resurrection, a glorified body, death defeated, the first fruits of the new creation. Jesus walked out of that tomb, not as a ghost, not as a spirit, but in a real, physical, glorified body that could be touched, that could eat, that bore the scars of crucifixion as proof of identity. The stone was rolled away, not to let Jesus out, but to let the witnesses in. Mary Magdalene came at dawn and found the tomb empty. She ran to tell Peter and John. They came running and found the grave clothes lying there, still in the shape of a body, but empty. Jesus was alive. Jesus appeared to his disciples multiple times, to Mary Magdalene in the garden, to the two on the road to Emmaus, to Peter privately, restoring him, to all the disciples in the locked room, showing them his hands and side, to Thomas, letting him touch the wounds, my Lord and my God. To 500 believers at once, according to Paul, he ate with them, taught them, prepared them for what came next. Then, 40 days after resurrection, he ascended into heaven. But he promised to return. 24 hours, that's all it took to change the course of human history. From Thursday evening when Judas left the upper room, to Friday afternoon when Jesus breathed his last. 24 hours of betrayal, denial, trials, torture, and death. But those 24 hours were followed by something even more extraordinary. 3 days of death defeated, 40 days of resurrection appearances, 2,000 years of changed lives, and an eternity of salvation for all who believe. We began this journey 24 hours before the crucifixion. We watched Peter declare his loyalty, then break his promise. We saw Judas betray with a kiss, then end his life in despair. We witnessed Jesus pray in agony, submit to arrest, endure trials, suffer torture, and die on a cross. We stood with Mary as she watched her son die. We followed John as he stayed when everyone else ran. We heard Jesus' 7 last words from the cross, and we witnessed the moment that split all of human history in two. But the story doesn't end at the tomb. Sunday came, and with it, resurrection. With it, hope. With it, the promise that death is not the end. Now it's your turn. What did you think of this journey through the final 24 hours before the crucifixion? Which moment touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and let me know. Was it Peter's bitter tears after the rooster crowed? Jesus praying, "Father, forgive them," while being tortured? Mary's steel resolve to stay with her son? The criminal finding grace in his final hour? The moment Jesus cried, "It is finished," or something else? Rate this narrative from 0 to 10. Your feedback helps me create more biblical content that brings Scripture to life. If this story strengthened your faith, if it helped you understand the cost of salvation, if it made the cross more real to you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because this isn't just history. This is your story. Jesus didn't die for humanity in general. He died for you specifically. Every lash of the whip, for you. Every thorn in the crown, for you. Every nail, for you. Father, forgive them. He was praying for you. It is finished. Your debt is paid. The question is, will you believe it? Will you accept what Jesus accomplished in those 24 hours? That's the only question that matters. And the answer determines not just the next 24 hours, but all of eternity. Thank you for taking this journey with me through Scripture. Through the darkest day in history that became the brightest hope for humanity. May the cross never become just a symbol to you. May it always be what it truly is, the ultimate act of love, the complete payment for sin, the open door to eternal life. God bless you. And remember, Sunday always comes.